Our final example in this section is of a piece for an action or chase scene, but in a more modern style. So, we are trying to be somewhat less typical orchestrally and more up to date. So this example will use orchestral instruments combined with more modern instruments to create a hybrid orchestra. So the first thing we will do is listen to our action example. Having listened through the action example, we can clearly hear that harmonically it is relatively simple, but it is very modern and dynamic all the same. The first thing to note is that the tempo is quite high. The tempo is set to 150 BPM, and for music with an epic feel, this is actually quite fast. But what this high tempo does is give the piece a lot of drive. To start the piece, I chose to look for a loop. And this is quite commonplace, especially if you are not a sound designer as such. There is no harm in using existing loops for your purposes. One sound that is very noticeable throughout the arrangement is from the Evolve Mutations 2 library. It's maybe not so common to start a piece with a sound like this, but in this case it suits it well. This library also allows you to control parameters such as filtering, and you can use this to create dynamics throughout the piece of music you are working on. Straight from the beginning, I layered it with another high-tempo percussion loop that also comes from the Evolve Mutations 2 library. If we look at the keyboard, we can use the top octaves to control certain parameters in this sequence. So this loop or sequence has some quite interesting articulation options available to it. We can see in the pattern itself that I have used some of these keys throughout the relevant part. Also, I simply copied this section rather than play it in throughout the whole piece. So having performed the first 13 bars, I simply repeat it. There's no harm in repeating sections if they are perfectly acceptable and performed as you wanted them to be. As well as these two loops, we have the rhythmic theme being performed on our Epic Toms and Albion Impact libraries. In previous chapters, we have spoken about musical themes and musical harmonies or chord progressions. But here we can see that themes can also be rhythmic. So in effect, these instruments are playing a rhythmic theme. The next thing that comes in is another sequence, or arpeggiated sound, from the Emutations Bits library. This is a very modern sound with some quite extreme panning included. At the same time, we also bring in a bass pattern from the Nexus Drum and Bass Loops library. All of these separate instruments are creating the drive we need for an action scene. The next thing that happens is that there are a few cymbals and our spiccato strings pattern. These are very powerful sounds, which is exactly what we need, and to increase the dynamics yet again, we double them with the Albion spiccato strings. These are somewhat less dominant, but certainly enhance and help the section grow. We can see that the accents are very strong in this section, and they also create movement in the rhythm, as the accents are not simply on the one of each beat, but are creating a contra-rhythm to the other straighter driving elements of the music. The next thing that comes in is the melody. Now, of course, this isn't a complex musical melody as such. It is simply an ascending line. But nevertheless, it does work as a melody. One thing I forgot to do was rename the track to the correct instrument. And the instrument I used is the Full Orchestra 3 Epic instrument. This comes from the Orchestral Essentials library. This is an extremely powerful sound, and exactly what we need for an action theme. After a certain amount of time, the brass has an additional octave added, and to widen the harmonic range of this piece, I bring in the Albion strings instrument, that is also playing a melodic line, but it is playing a descending line. So as we listen, we can hear just how rich this section is. And then, to increase the power yet again, we bring in the high brass. What we have done in this example is to start with a pulsating rhythmic element and rather than use the orchestral instruments to add more rhythmic elements, we have used them to create the more interesting melodic or harmonic elements of the music. The fact that the higher instruments are creating long melodic lines creates the epic effect, whilst the rhythmic or lower elements create the driving rhythm needed. Once we have reached the climax, we simply drop everything down to a new rhythmic element. This element comes from the Nexus library and is a very atmospheric sequence with some movement in the filtering. This effect is very typical when going from one scene to another. Rather than bringing in new music for the next section straight away, we simply cross over the scenes with a transitional piece. So here, our rhythmic Nexus sequence can be used as a transitional piece between two scenes. Of course, you could build yet again from this section if you wish to, and return to the beginning of our action theme. One thing that continues on from our original piece is the clock type sequence that has been running throughout. So this gives us continuity, and also an ending in that we can fade it out, just like this if need be. And the new sequence can end with a lovely wash of reverb. So hopefully in this chapter on epic trailers, you will have seen some of the tricks and techniques available to you that can help you create your own epic trailers.